Hello, good people of YouTube. Today we are talking again about AIOps Explained, and we are still in the mini-series where we are talking about the IBM Cloud Pak for AIOps in the release news of version 4.5. And today we're going to talk about enriching topology, and we are using JSON formatted files, which is a very convenient way of doing that kind of thing. And this is going to be introduced by Steve Howell. He's a developer, Netco Agile Service Manager, expert, Scrum Master, and he is also part of IBM Research and Development. And this is an overview of the mini-series that we are doing here. So quite a number of topics in individual videos. And today's video is here, the second last but one. And if you want to read about how to do all these kind of things, and this is a link into the whole topic. And without further ado, over to you. Take us away.
Thanks for the introduction. Welcome to the talk from me and Seb on the topology side of AIOps. So this is going to be talking about a couple of things that have happened in the 4.5 release. I'm going to be starting off by talking about enriching observation data using JSON-based file enrichment. So in terms of a use case, it can be summarized like this. A customer wishes to add additional custom properties to resources that are loaded by an off-the-shelf observer. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about what I mean by that. So just as a bit of background, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, understand quite a bit about AIOps and the topology part of it, but in case you don't, I'll go through a bit of background. So we have these things called observers, and their job is to load topology data into AIOps. And in the majority of cases, those observers are looking at external systems of some kind. So the two exceptions are the file observer and the REST observer, which are more like a toolkit for customers to load any data they want. But the rest of the observers are all dedicated to looking at some particular external system. So it could be Kubernetes, could be ServiceNow, could be Azure. There's a big bunch of them. With those observers, because they're looking at a particular system that they're hard coded to know about, then they know what's being advertised by that system and what's being stored in it. Therefore, they will load a fixed set of properties for the resources that get loaded. Moving on to the next concept, and that's about topology rules. So again, you might know topology rules are used to process and enrich resources, and that is done as part of the data loading procedure. So you've got the observer that is looking at your target system, and that is loading the data from that target system. But then the rules then do some post-process, if you like, on top of that data. Traditionally, those have a specific purpose. So it could be you want to do some data merging. You've got resources coming from two different places, and you want to tell the system that they're actually the same resource. Or it could be for tagging resources, which means they're easier to search for in the user interface. So that's typically one reason why you might use rules. The rule type called the file enrichment rules introduced in version 4.3 of AIOps, and that was introduced specifically to support GIS use cases, because at the current time, only two of the observers, that's the ITNM and the Sienna Blue Planet observer, have the ability to obtain locational data for the resources and load that in as part of the resource loading, which means that for all the other observers, you're getting the data as normal, but you're not getting any information about location. So we came up with this idea of the file enrichment rule, where like a normal rule, it's used to add data to the resources, but in this case, it's specifically adding a geolocation. And in order to know what the geolocation is, it uses an external file. So when you define the rule, you also point it at a file that contains a latitude and a longitude for your resources. Okay, so that was all something that happened in 4.3. In this version, in AIOps 4.5, that file enrichment rule concept has been extended to also support a more generic format, a JSON-based format, and it doesn't relate specifically to GIS. It is used more to load any custom property that you wish to load against your resources. So it works in a similar way to the GIS one, but it's a more generic case. Let me show you a demo. So here's an AIOps system. I've got a few tabs open already to save me hunting around in menus. So currently I'm looking at the resource management page, which, as you know, this is a way to look at the inventory of your topological data. And I've done a search here, 8.8.8.8, and I'm looking at a bunch of resources. And these are resources that I have loaded already into the system using the DNS observer. So this is one of our off-the-shelf observers. And what that's been configured to do is do a forward lookup on IBM.com. And it's doing that through the Google DNS server, which is the 8.8.8.8. So that's the data it's got already. And if I bring up the details for one of these resources, we can see this is the set of properties that get loaded, and this is the stuff that's loaded by the DNS observer. So these are the sort of what I was talking about as a sort of set of standard properties. Like this is what the DNS observer knows about, and this is what it can grab. So it can like an IP number, a last broadcast time, things like that. So this is the sort of standard information that can be loaded. But let's say that in my situation as a customer, I happen to know some extra information about these resources. It's not information that got loaded by the DNS observer because maybe it wasn't available through those endpoints, but I happen to know some additional information. I can now use this JSON-based file enrichment rule to enrich these resources with those custom properties. So if we look at an example of an enrichment file, this is a simple example. So you can see that each line of this file enrichment file is a JSON string, and it's like a JSON object that contains properties and values. And the important points to note are that one property on each row represents some kind of lookup identifier. So in this case, it's a property called key, and the value of that key is going to be some sort of lookup value, which I'm going to use to match these against actual resources. So you can see each line has a key, and then it has a bunch of other properties. And these are the custom properties that I want to also associate with my resources. So let's say in my case, I also know for each of my resources, I know an organization, a manager, a category, could be anything. Okay, but these are just the examples I'm using here. So I've got these properties for all of the different rows here that I want to match up to my resources. Okay, if I quickly come back to resource management, if you look at these properties again, just to confirm that the org, manager, and category are not currently in that list. Okay, so I'm just showing you that those are custom properties that don't exist in the standard data that the DNS observer will be loading. And that's why I'm going to use a file enrichment rule, so I can get those extra custom properties loaded from that file against the resources. So what I would do is go to the rules UI. So here it is here. We have all our different rule types, and here is the file enrichment rules. I've created it earlier to save a bit of time. So here is my file enrichment rule that I'm going to use to do my enrichment. So if we just have a quick look at the definition. So it's got a name that's enabled. So one thing that's very important is the token. Here, the token is going to be the property, or a combination of properties if you're using regex, but in this simple case, it's the property that you're going to use to provide the lookup value that's then going to be matched against the lookup in the file. So in this case, I'm going to use the unique ID of my resource as like the key, as the lookup. So what's going to happen is when the rule is processing, it's going to grab the unique ID of a resource and see if any of the key values in the enrichment file match that unique ID. And if they do, then it's going to go, this applies to that resource. Let me load in those custom properties against that resource. Okay, choose the file format. So we've got the GeoPoint format, which is what I was talking about, was introduced in 4.3, but we want to keep this as JSON. Then we use a file. So I previously did an upload to load this in. It's now sitting on the server. So that's the file, and that's just pointing at the file I was just showing you. And then finally, the enrichment file key. So this is the name of the property in that JSON file. It's the name of the property, which is representing the lookup value. So if you remember, that was called key in my case. And that's it. That's really, I could add some conditions if I needed to restrict when this rule applies. So I could, for example, say only apply it when you're running the DNS observer and you apply it to these entity types, but I'm just going to leave it open for now. But that is essentially my rule definition done. Okay, and so the next step is essentially when any more loading is done, that rule is now enabled and it should be processed, and if it has some work to do, it will do it. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take this job here. This is my DNS observer job that I used previously to load those resources that I was showing you, and I'm going to run it again. And the idea of running it again is just an example of me re-observing that data. But in the process of re-observing it, I should find that as well as the observer running and looking at those resources again, I should find that the rule has now taken effect because that's in my sort of admin definition. But here's all my resources. Here are the resources I had before. If I look at the details, you can see that I've got all the properties I had before, but I've now got some additional ones. I've got category set to comms in this case. I've got manager set to Tony S, and I've got org set to IBM ITOps. So you can see that these resources, as well as having those standard set of properties from the DNS observer, I've now got those custom properties that came from the enrichment file. We'll just look at one more example. Let's say UDP53. If I just refer back to my files, you can see this also had a manager of Tony S and an org of IBM ITOps. And you can see manager Tony S, org of ITOps. So yep, it seems to have successfully enriched my resources with the values in this file. So it's quite a simple concept, but it could be quite powerful because it's a way for customers to add that extra information, that extra context that may be important to them and their business, and then they can see it in the user interface. They could create tools that are based on it. They could create styling that was based on it. They could do all sorts of things. So it's just a matter of getting it in there, and this is one way of doing it. Obviously, if they've got completely customized data, they might be loading it with the file observer. And if that's the case, then all their custom properties are going to be in that file anyway. So that's not particularly useful, but it's for these cases where you're using an observer that's looking at a particular endpoint, like in this case DNS, could be Kubernetes, whatever, where the observer itself will load that standard set of properties and you want to add to them. So that's really where you would use this feature. Okay, that's the end of my demo. If there are any questions, please put them on Slack channel.
Thank you, Steve. That was really cool. I liked it. And with that, we are almost finishing the mini series. It's just one little more video left. And I'd like to thank you to the audience and for spending your time with us. And please come again when it's time again for AIOps Explained. And see you until then. Bye.